Hello, welcome to the channel. Get ready for a story that will give even the bravest of chills. If you like to feel the chills down your spine and your heart racing, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and embark with me on this journey of mystery and terror. I'd been a long-haul trucker for over a decade, navigating countless miles of lonely roads. That night, the moon hung low and full in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the desolate highway I was traveling. The only company I had was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. As I drove, the darkness seemed to press in on me, and an uneasy feeling settled over me. Around midnight, a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the road ahead. I slowed down, my high beams cutting through the thick mist, when I saw a figure standing by the roadside. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. I could barely make out his features through the fog, but something about him made me uneasy. I pulled over, my truck's brakes screeching slightly as I stopped. The man approached my cab slowly, his movements deliberate and unnervingly calm. I rolled down the window, and he stared at me with hollow eyes. His face was partially hidden in shadow, but his gaze was piercing, as though he could see straight into my soul. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just continued to stare, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice a rasping whisper. "Take me to the next town." There was something unsettling about his request. It wasn't the way he asked, but the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for something. Against my better judgment, I agreed and led him into the cab. He sat silently beside me, his presence making the air in the truck feel colder. As I drove, I tried to make small talk, but he offered no response. The fog outside grew thicker, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. I could barely see the road, and my nerves were on edge. The silence between us was almost deafening. Occasionally, I would glance over at him, only to find him staring ahead, his face still shrouded in shadow. Suddenly, the truck's headlights caught something in the distance, a figure lying in the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches away from what appeared to be a body. My heart raced as I climbed out to investigate. As I approached, the body seemed to dissolve into the fog, vanishing before my eyes. Confused and terrified, I returned to the truck and started driving again. My passenger was still silent, but now his presence felt more menacing. I could sense something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't place what it was. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with fear. The fog began to lift slightly, and I could see the outline of an old abandoned house off to the side of the road. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Broken windows, sagging roof, and an overgrown yard. My passenger suddenly straightened in his seat, pointing towards the house. "Stop here," he said, his voice now colder and more commanding. I hesitated, but then complied, pulling up in front of the decrepit building. The fog was almost completely gone now, revealing the true horror of the house. I glanced over at the man, but he was gone. The seat next to me was empty, and the door was ajar. I got out of the truck, my breath visible in the chilly night air. The house seemed to beckon me, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes watching my every move. I approached cautiously, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness. As I reached the front door, which hung slightly open on its hinges, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a pool of blood leading inside. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me, trapping me inside. The darkness within the house was almost palpable, the air thick with decay and mold. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness in narrow, jittery strips. The beam fell upon a figure at the end of the hallway, a woman, her clothes tattered and stained with blood, her face twisted in a silent scream. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind me, and I spun around to see the man from the truck standing in the doorway. His hat was now gone, revealing a face that was almost skeletal, with hollow eye sockets and a grin stretched unnaturally wide. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice a chilling breeze. Now you're part of the story. Panic surged through me as I turned to run, but the house seemed to twist and shift, the hallway elongating and warping. The woman's scream grew louder, filling the air with its haunting wail. I sprinted through the dark corridors, my flashlight flickering as I searched desperately for an exit. Finally, I burst through the front door and stumbled back outside. The night was eerily quiet, the fog now gone, but the house loomed behind me, as if mocking my escape. I raced back to the truck, my heart still racing, and drove away as fast as I could. When I reached the next town, I was a trembling wreck. I tried to explain what happened to the local authorities, but they looked at me with pitying eyes and told me that the house had been abandoned for decades, and no one had lived there for years. I later learned from locals that the man I had picked up was a ghost, a spirit of someone who had died tragically on that very road. He and his companion, the woman, were forever bound to that cursed house, their souls trapped in an endless cycle of horror. And now, every time someone unknowingly drives by, their spirits reach out, seeking to add to their collection of lost souls. To this day, I avoid that highway at all costs. The memory of that night still haunts me, and every time I pass a deserted stretch of road, I can't help but wonder if I'll see that ghostly figure again, waiting for his next ride into the unknown. It was just past midnight when I found myself driving down a remote rural road that twisted and turned through thick woods. The fog was rolling in heavily, blanketing the road in a ghostly shroud that reduced visibility to a mere few feet. My headlights struggled to cut through the dense mist, and every so often a chilling breeze would seep through the cracks in my old pickup truck, sending shivers down my spine. I had been driving for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. I'd hoped to reach the small town up ahead, but the fog seemed to get denser with every mile. As I navigated a particularly sharp bend, I suddenly saw a small figure standing right in the middle of the road. Panic surged through me as I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop mere inches from the figure. I could barely make out the form of a child, no older than 8 or 9, standing in the road, dressed in a ragged white dress. The child's face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. She was standing still, her gaze fixed on the truck, and she didn't move as I approached. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck, calling out gently, "Hey, are you okay? What are you doing out here alone?" The child didn't respond. She simply continued to stare at me with those unsettling, glowing eyes. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I got closer, I noticed her feet were bare and dirty. The white dress she wore tattered and stained. "Are you lost?" I asked, trying to sound as soothing as possible. "Do you need help?" The child finally spoke, her voice a soft whisper that seemed to blend with the mist. "Help me. I'm cold. Please take me home." I hesitated, glancing around at the fog-covered road. There was no sign of any nearby houses or shelters. I felt a gnawing sense of dread, but my instincts told me I couldn't just leave her there. I gently guided her toward the truck, her tiny hand cold and clammy as she took it. We both climbed into the cab, and I started driving slowly, trying to make out any landmarks through the fog. The child remained eerily silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she lived, but she didn't respond. Her presence was unnerving, her silence almost oppressive. After what felt like an eternity of driving through the fog, we finally reached a small, dilapidated house at the edge of a clearing. It was an old, decrepit structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. It looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. I turned to the child, trying to ignore the rising feeling of unease. "Is this where you live?" The child nodded, her gaze still fixed ahead. I parked the truck and got out, walking around to open the passenger door for her. She stepped out and started toward the house without a word, her bare feet barely making a sound on the gravel. As she approached the house, I noticed something strange. The air around the house seemed to pulse with a cold, unnatural energy, and the fog seemed to thicken, swirling around the edges of the property. I followed her to the front porch, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you sure this is your home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The child turned and looked at me, her eyes now glowing more intensely. There was something in her gaze that made me feel like I was being watched by something beyond the physical world. She nodded again and slowly opened the front door. As she stepped inside, the door creaked open to reveal a dark, dusty interior. The faint sound of whispers seemed to emanate from within, carried on the cold breeze that swept through the house. I watched as she disappeared into the darkness, and a wave of anxiety washed over me. I felt a compulsion to follow, but something held me back. Just as I was about to turn away, the child's voice echoed from inside, her tone now frantic and pleading. "Help me, please." Without thinking, I stepped inside the house, driven by a mixture of fear and a desire to help. The interior was, as I had feared, dilapidated and overrun with dust and cobwebs. The floorboards creaked ominously under my weight, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I called out for the child, but there was no response. As I moved deeper into the house, I noticed that the walls were covered with strange markings, symbols and words scrawled in a language I couldn't understand. The atmosphere was suffused with an eerie, malevolent energy that seemed to grow stronger with each step I took. I reached a large, open room at the back of the house, where the air was even colder. In the center of the room was an old, decrepit rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth as if someone had just been sitting in it. My heart raced as I approached, and that's when I saw her again, the child standing in the corner of the room, her eyes now wide and filled with terror. She was no longer the same calm, ghostly figure I had seen before. Her face was now twisted in a grotesque expression of fear, and she pointed toward a darkened doorway at the far end of the room. I felt a cold draft emanating from that doorway, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Summoning every ounce of courage, I moved toward the doorway, the whispers turning into frantic, unintelligible cries. As I entered the room beyond, I was hit by a wave of icy coldness that took my breath away. The room was completely dark, save for a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Underneath it was a large, ancient mirror, its surface cracked and covered in grime. The child was nowhere to be seen, but as I approached the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Reflected in the cracked glass was a scene from the past. A family gathered around a table, their faces filled with joy. But behind them, in the shadows, was a dark figure watching silently. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The whispers had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The mirror began to pulse with a dark energy, and I felt a chilling presence closing in on me. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A shadowy figure, barely visible, standing by the doorway. It was tall and formless, with eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. My heart raced as I ran back through the house, the shadowy figure following close behind. I burst out of the house and back into the fog, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The truck was still parked in the driveway, and I jumped in, starting the engine with trembling hands. As I drove away, I glanced back and saw the house slowly fading into the fog, its dark presence receding into the mist. The drive back to town was a blur of fear and adrenaline. I reached the town's small, dimly lit diner and collapsed into a booth, my mind reeling from the experience. The locals looked at me with concern as I recounted the story, but they merely nodded in sympathy. It wasn't until later that I learned the horrifying truth about that house. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since a family had vanished without a trace. The locals spoke of a dark presence that haunted the house, claiming that it preyed on those who wandered too close, drawing them into its malevolent grasp. To this day, I avoid that road at all costs. The image of that child and the dark figure still haunt my dreams, and the memory of the house remains a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie hidden in the fog. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, delivering a shipment of supplies to a remote logging camp deep in the forest. The camp had been silent for a while, with no radio contact, which was unusual but not unheard of. I wasn't particularly worried, just a bit apprehensive about driving alone through the dense forest at night. The winding roads and the oppressive darkness were enough to unsettle anyone. The journey began in late afternoon, and I was making good time until the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest grew darker and denser as night fell, the trees pressing in like ancient sentinels. The only light came from my truck's headlights, barely penetrating the thick black curtain of trees and mist that hung heavily in the air. Around midnight, the fog thickened, curling around the truck and reducing visibility to almost zero. The air was damp and cold, and every now and then, the wind would pick up, sending eerie, whispering sounds through the trees. I found myself on a particularly narrow stretch of road when I noticed something unusual. A series of small, flickering lights scattered in the distance, like a cluster of lanterns floating in the mist. Curiosity got the better of me, so I slowed down and pulled over to investigate. The lights seemed to be coming from an old abandoned homestead that I had somehow missed on my previous drives. The house was ancient, its structure sagging under the weight of years and neglect. The flickering lights were coming from a series of candles arranged around the property in a seemingly ritualistic pattern. I got out of the truck and approached the house cautiously. The ground was uneven and treacherous, covered in a layer of wet leaves that made every step a challenge. The front porch creaked ominously under my weight, and I hesitated before pushing open the front door. It swung open with a groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell of decay and mildew hit me immediately. The air inside was heavy, and every surface was coated in a thick layer of dust. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating grotesque shapes that danced in the corners of my vision. As I explored the ground floor, I noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols and runes scrawled in what looked like old blood. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I ascended the creaking staircase to the second floor, where the whispers grew louder, echoing through the darkened halls. The walls on this floor were adorned with faded photographs, their subjects long forgotten. One photograph in particular caught my eye, an old family portrait with a woman and two children, their faces frozen in expressions of fear. As I examined the photo, a loud crash came from downstairs, making me jump. My heart raced as I rushed back down to find the source of the noise. The candles outside had gone out, and the house was now plunged into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the truck and made my way back inside, determined to uncover what was happening. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the abandoned rooms. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I noticed that the candles had been extinguished. Their wax dripped and congealed on the ground. The house seemed to groan and creak as though it were alive, responding to my presence with an almost malevolent intelligence. I reached the basement door, which had been slightly ajar. A dark, almost palpable energy emanated from within. I hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by a mixture of fear and determination, I descended the stairs. The basement was a large open space, filled with old furniture and broken appliances covered in dust. In the center of the room was a large antique mirror, its surface cracked and coated with grime. The mirror was surrounded by strange symbols and what looked like old ritualistic items, candles, feathers, and dark stains on the floor. The whispers grew louder as I approached the mirror, and I felt an icy chill as I looked into its dark, reflective surface. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and for a brief moment, I saw something move behind me. I spun around, but the basement was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, I saw figures moving in the reflection, ghostly apparitions of the family from the photograph, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish. The whispers grew into a cacophony of tortured cries, filling the room with an oppressive, malevolent presence. Suddenly, the mirror shattered with a loud, resonant crash, and the room was plunged into darkness. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The whispers turned into screams, and I could hear the sound of something, or someone, moving around me, brushing past my legs and making the air feel even colder. I scrambled up the stairs, the screams echoing in my ears, and burst out of the house into the cold, misty night. My truck was still there, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. As I started the engine and sped away, I glanced back at the house. The flickering candlelight had returned, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist on the walls. The drive back to the logging camp was a blur of fear and adrenaline. I finally reached the camp and relayed the events to the workers there. They looked at me with a mix of pity and dread. The camp manager explained that the house had once belonged to a family who had vanished under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The locals believed it was cursed, a place where dark rituals had been performed in a desperate bid for power. They warned me never to go near that place again, as the spirits of the family were said to haunt the house, forever trapped in their suffering. I never took another delivery through that area, and the memory of that night still haunts me. The echoes of the whispers, the cold, the oppressive darkness, all serve as a constant reminder of the horrors that lie hidden in the shadows of the whispering pines. I never imagined a simple detour would lead me to such a nightmare. I was driving home late one evening, a long day at work having left me exhausted. The GPS on my phone directed me along a shortcut through a remote area to avoid heavy traffic. I wasn't familiar with the route, but it seemed straightforward enough. Just a winding road through some countryside. The road was poorly lit, lined with dense woods on either side. The headlights of my car barely cut through the darkness, and the eerie stillness of the night was unsettling. As I drove, I noticed that the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of the small towns or landmarks that should have been visible according to the map. An hour into the drive, the GPS signal suddenly cut out. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping to get my bearings. The darkness outside was nearly complete, with only the faint, ghostly glow of the moon filtering through the canopy of trees. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant, indistinguishable sounds from the forest. I got out of the car and walked a few steps into the woods, hoping to spot any landmarks or signs of civilization. The forest seemed alive with strange noises, cracking branches, whispers on the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was then that I noticed something odd, a narrow path that seemed to cut through the forest, leading away from the main road. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the path. It was poorly maintained, overgrown with vines and brambles, and the ground was uneven. As I walked, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if I were being watched. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were following me, echoing from the trees. The path eventually led to a small, dilapidated house, its structure barely holding together. The house looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The front yard was overrun with weeds and overgrowth, and a rusted swing set creaked eerily in the breeze. The whole place had an air of decay and neglect. I approached the house cautiously, my flashlight beam flickering erratically. The front door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The interior was filled with old, rotting furniture and piles of dust. But there was an odd, unsettling feeling about the place. I ventured further into the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and decay. I found a staircase leading to the second floor and decided to investigate. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder as I ascended. At the top of the stairs, I discovered a long hallway lined with doors. I noticed that some of the doors were slightly ajar, and I could hear faint noises coming from within, murmurs and shuffling sounds. I approached one of the doors and peered inside. The room was dark, but I could make out what appeared to be a child's bedroom. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper depicting whimsical scenes of forests and animals. A small, dust-covered bed sat in the corner, and a collection of old toys lay scattered on the floor. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive sadness. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from downstairs, followed by the sound of something or someone moving around the house. I froze, my heart pounding. The noises grew louder, and the house seemed to come alive with a strange energy. The whispers that had been barely audible before were now a cacophony of voices, overlapping and chaotic. I hurried back downstairs, but the house seemed to have changed. The layout was different, with hallways and rooms that hadn't been there before. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the temperature dropped significantly. My breath fogged up in the cold air, and I could see my own fear reflected in the windows. I reached the main floor and found that the front door was now shut tight, as if it had never been open. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were now interspersed with ghostly wails and cries for help. I turned around and saw shadowy figures moving through the house, faint, indistinct shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. I could hear footsteps behind me growing closer, but when I turned, there was no one there. The oppressive presence in the house seemed to close in on me, its malevolent energy nearly tangible. Desperate, I grabbed a nearby lamp and used it to smash a window, hoping to escape. As the glass shattered, a cold wind rushed in, carrying with it a chilling, mournful wail. I climbed through the window and landed outside, but the forest was different. The path I had followed was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees and darkness. I wandered through the forest, trying to find my way back to the road. The trees seemed to twist and shift, creating an ever-changing maze. The whispers followed me, growing more insistent and frantic. The air was filled with a sense of dread, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. Hours passed, and exhaustion took its toll. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled upon a clearing with an old, weathered road sign that read, "Vanishing Road." The sign was barely visible, obscured by dirt and moss, but it was enough to guide me back to the main road. As I emerged onto the road, the fog had lifted slightly, and the first light of dawn was beginning to appear. I collapsed into my car and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The drive back was a blur of fear and fatigue, and I didn't stop until I reached a familiar, safe area. When I finally arrived home, I was met with relief and disbelief. I tried to recount the events of the night, but it sounded like a bad dream. The locals I spoke to later were familiar with the Vanishing Road, but had their own chilling tales of disappearances and strange occurrences in the area. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road, and the memory of the house and the whispers haunts my dreams. The Vanishing Road remains a dark, unsettling reminder of the horrors that lie hidden in the darkness, waiting to claim those who stray too far from the safety of the known. The night was as black as the void. I had been on the road for hours, following a scenic route through Ridgewood Pass, a remote and often bypassed stretch of highway that cut through the heart of the mountainous forest. I had taken this route to clear my head after a rough week, hoping the isolation and tranquility would help me unwind. Little did I know, I was about to drive straight into a living nightmare. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by towering trees that seemed to reach for the sky. The air was thick with fog, and the temperature had dropped sharply as night fell. The headlights of my car barely cut through the mist, making the drive treacherous. As I navigated the curves and bends, a growing sense of unease settled over me. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the roadside, barely visible through the fog. It was a woman, her dress tattered and her hair disheveled. She seemed to be waving frantically, as if in distress. I pulled over, my instincts telling me to help despite the eerie circumstances. I approached her cautiously. She looked at me with hollow eyes, her face pale and drawn. "Please," she said in a voice that trembled with fear. "You have to help me. I'm lost." I offered to give her a ride, but she hesitated. "I can't go back," she said. "They're looking for me." Her eyes darted nervously around, as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. Despite my better judgment, I insisted she get into the car. She finally complied, taking a seat in the passenger side. As I drove, she revealed little about herself, only that her name was Emily and that she had been wandering these woods for days. The fog grew thicker as we continued, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. Emily's presence in the car was unsettling. She occasionally glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, as if afraid of being followed. Her demeanor was increasingly erratic, and her whispers seemed to mix with the howling wind outside. Around an hour later, we reached a fork in the road, a place I didn't remember from earlier. The road signs were obscured by the fog, and I was unsure which direction to take. Emily seemed agitated. "Not that way," she said urgently. "We need to go right." I took the right fork, but the road immediately grew rougher, with potholes and uneven terrain. The forest around us became denser, the trees leaning in as if to block our way. The atmosphere grew heavier, and the fog seemed to take on a sinister quality. As we continued, the car's engine began to sputter and stall. I pulled over, trying to restart it, but it was no use. We were stranded. Emily's anxiety grew palpable, and she clutched the seat as if it were a lifeline. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." I tried to comfort her, but her fear was contagious. The silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of our breaths and the occasional rustle of leaves. I decided to check the engine, hoping to find some clue as to why the car had stopped. As I opened the hood, the fog seemed to thicken and the temperature dropped further. I could barely see anything in the darkness. The eerie stillness was suddenly broken by a distant mournful cry, like the wail of a lost soul. I looked around, my heart racing. The fog seemed to swirl and twist, and the shadows between the trees seemed to move with a life of their own. I returned to the car and saw Emily staring wide-eyed into the darkness, her face a mask of terror. Without warning, the car's interior lights flickered and went out. The car was now engulfed in darkness. Emily's breathing became ragged, and she started to mutter incoherently. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of impending doom. A sudden noise outside the car made us both jump. It sounded like something, or someone, scratching at the windows. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and stepped out, shining the beam into the surrounding forest. The light barely pierced the fog, revealing nothing but endless, swirling shadows. I heard the noise again, closer this time, like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, and the temperature dropped further. I felt an icy chill creep over me. When I returned to the car, Emily was no longer in her seat. Panic surged through me as I searched the interior, calling her name. There was no response. I stepped outside again, scanning the area with the flashlight. The fog seemed to close in around me, and I felt a presence lurking just beyond the reach of the light. As I wandered through the fog, I noticed strange markings on the trees, runes and symbols scratched into the bark. The symbols were unfamiliar and unsettling, and they seemed to form a pattern that led deeper into the forest. The cries and whispers grew louder, and I could hear them coming from all directions. I followed the markings, hoping they would lead me to Emily. The forest was alive with strange sounds, scratches, rustles, and distant, echoing cries. Eventually, I came upon a small clearing with an old, decrepit cabin in the center. The cabin looked as though it had been abandoned for years, its wooden walls rotting and its windows shattered. The symbols I had seen earlier were etched into the doorframe. I approached the cabin cautiously, the whispers in my ears growing louder and more frantic. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was heavy with a foul stench, and the floor was covered in old, decaying furniture. As I entered the cabin, I noticed a faint light coming from a corner room. I approached and found Emily standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with terror. She was staring at an old, ornate mirror that hung on the wall. The mirror's surface was covered in grime, but it seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly light. Emily was speaking in a language I didn't understand, her voice filled with desperation. I tried to reach her, but as I stepped closer, a powerful force seemed to push me back. The room grew colder, and the shadows around the mirror seemed to move and shift. Suddenly, the mirror shattered with a deafening crash, and a cold, malevolent energy surged through the room. Emily screamed, and the entire cabin seemed to shake. I felt an invisible hand grip my throat, squeezing with a vice-like force. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, and the cabin seemed to warp and twist around me. The whispers turned into a cacophony of tortured voices, and the air was filled with a sense of impending doom. The mirror's shards glowed with an unnatural light, casting eerie reflections on the walls. In the chaos, I saw ghostly figures emerging from the shattered mirror, tortured souls with hollow eyes and twisted faces. They reached out towards me, their fingers grasping for my soul. I tried to escape, but the room seemed to close in on me, trapping me in a nightmarish vortex. Just as I thought I couldn't endure anymore, I was thrown out of the cabin and into the clearing. The fog seemed to lift slightly, and the cries and whispers faded into the distance. I looked back at the cabin, but it was gone, replaced by an empty, desolate forest. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I ran back to my car, which miraculously started on the first try. I drove away from Ridgewood Pass as fast as I could, the memory of that night forever etched in my mind. When I finally reached a safe area, I tried to tell my story, but it was met with skepticism and disbelief. The locals spoke of Ridgewood Pass as a place where strange occurrences were common, but they offered no explanations. Some whispered about ancient rituals and curses, while others simply avoided the area altogether. To this day, I avoid Ridgewood Pass, and the memory of that night remains a haunting reminder of the horrors that lie hidden in the darkness. The echoing cries, the shadowy figures, and the malevolent energy of the cabin are a constant reminder of the terror that waits for those who stray too close to the edge of the unknown. If you enjoyed this scary story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling tales. And remember, next time you're driving alone at night, think twice before stopping to help someone on the road. Sometimes looks can be deceiving, and what you see may not be of this world.